Greetings, this is Mike Billington, an editor of the Executive Intelligence Review, and with the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization. I'm very pleased to have with me today Colonel Richard Black. Colonel Black served in the Marines during the Vietnam War. He then got a degree in law following that service and served in the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps. Ended up heading the Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon. He then he ran for office and served in the state of Virginia's House of Delegates from 1998 to 2005, and the Virginia Senate from 2011 to 2019. He became a staunch opponent of the U.S. regime change wars in the Middle East, exposing especially the illegal and criminal nature of the U.S. war in Syria. So welcome, Colonel Black.
Mike, it's good to be with you this morning.
Our interview in May, which focused on the wars in Syria and Ukraine, had well over 1 million viewers and was translated into a half dozen or more languages with thousands of comments. And the comments were all full of praise for a senior military officer in the United States who tells the truth about the failings of this nation's military policies and the moral decay in the nation in general. So much has happened since then, but not, sadly, to make things any better. So let me start by asking you to comment on the recent decision from NATO and from the U.S. to send both German Leopard 2 tanks and the U.S. Abrams M1 tanks to Ukraine. Perhaps you can comment on the Russian response and whether or not you think this will make any difference whatsoever in the conflict itself.
You know, there's a tremendous amount of gamesmanship that's going on regarding the constant escalation in this war. Let me just step back for a moment and sort of lay the groundwork for where we were. Ukraine is President Obama's war. When Obama was in office, he came into office, was immediately given the Nobel Peace Prize, even though he had never done anything yet. It was done in anticipation that he would sort of be this great peacemaker, or at least they wanted to create that perception. The fact is that he went on through his time in office to prove to be one of the most cruel, perverse, and bloodthirsty presidents in our history. He launched unprovoked wars against Libya, against Syria, against the poor tribesmen of Yemen. And then he set up the groundwork for a great war against Russia, which would take place in Ukraine. And he gave the go-ahead for the Central Intelligence Agency and British MI6 to conduct an extraordinarily violent coup in Kiev, in which they overthrew the duly elected president of Ukraine, President Yanukovych. And so that sort of laid the groundwork. Now, you've seen this constant escalation in terms of weapons pouring in, more and more advanced weapons all the time. The most recent debate was over tanks. Zelensky was put out there with his green T-shirt and told that we've got to have these tanks. Finally, there was a debate back and forth. I think some of it genuine, much of it disingenuous, designed to fool the Western publics about what was going on. And finally, the British, who are always there with their banking dynasties and their moral corruption in London, they finally said, well, we're going to break the logjam. We're going to give 10 Challenger tanks. So they did that. And then the next thing, President Biden said, well, we're not going to give tanks. And Chancellor Schultz, who was under a lot of pressure to give German Leopard tanks, said, well, we're not going to give Leopard tanks unless the United States does. And after all of this charade took place, eventually, then the Polish, which had become a very, very warlike country recently, they began to say, well, we're going to offer up Leopard tanks. And anyway, the logjam broke. The United States said, okay, we will provide 31 M1 tanks. In turn, Germany said, okay, we will give 10 or 12 Leopard tanks. Poland jumped in and they gave a number of Leopard tanks. Other countries had Leopards. In the end, suddenly here we had over 100 main battle tanks offered up and being ready to go. Very soon thereafter, there was immediate discussion about ratcheting up the number of tanks. Some talked about 300 tanks, some talked about a great number more. The day following the announcement that the US and Germany would provide tanks, Zelensky said, well, that's not going to do it. We need to have F-16 fighter planes. And immediately you started to hear this receptive audience among the military industrial complex in the West saying, well, yeah, they probably ought to have F-16 jets. So we see this constant escalation. Now, as to the tanks themselves, what effect will they have? They will have some effect. However, they're being cycled in over time. There's quite a logistics network that has to be put in place. Probably some of it has already been set up, but much of it has not. So they will drift in during the course of the next year. The biggest batch of tanks are the German Leopard tanks. We have experience. We have very firm intelligence about the Leopard tanks because they were used in Syria, and the Turkish army used them in northern Syria against the Syrian army and against the Kurdish forces. They were knocked out just like any other tanks. So they didn't prove to be invincible at all. So you have that, and then you have this batch of M1 tanks. Now, there is a problem with the M1 tanks. I can't tell you exactly how serious it is because it's never really been tested. But the M1 tank is unique in that it uses an aviation-style turbine engine. All other tanks use diesel engines. Now, many people are aware that the turbine engine has very rapid fuel consumption, but I don't think that's the biggest issue. I think the biggest issue is that the turbine engine has an enormous heat signature. When they run, they give off tremendous amount of heat. Potentially, these tanks are vulnerable to heat-seeking missiles. And in an environment where neither side is likely to have complete air domination, I think there's a very real possibility that the M1 tanks will be vulnerable to heat-seeking missiles. So in any event, I think the tanks are not going to be a real game changer. They'll have some effect. They'll help the Ukrainians, but they're not going to be decisive. In the end, The huge vulnerability of the Ukrainians is the massive casualties that they have taken. This is not nearly as populous a country as Russia is. Their population base is much smaller, and there have been 7 or 8 million Ukrainians who fled Ukraine in order to escape the draft and escape the war. So they have a diminished population, and at the same time, they're taking casualties. We calculate their casualties as being somewhere around, on a per capita basis, somewhere around 150 times what we suffered in Vietnam, which was America's last truly bloody war. This is not a sustainable figure. They cannot replace their manpower over time. And eventually, I suspect that NATO troops will have to replace them on the ground and actually have NATO forces fighting against Russian forces.
Well, that's a stark statement. Commentators and politicians are now very loosely chattering about the use of nuclear weapons, so openly that Russia has announced that it may have to drop their policy, long-held policy of a no first strike of nuclear weapons, if it appears to them that there is an actual threat to their nation's existence being prepared. Seeing the deployment of the NATO tanks and US tanks to the Russian border with missile sites in Poland and in the Czech Republic, and about 1,000, I think it's estimated, US nuclear weapons deployed in European NATO countries. Such a threat was taken seriously in Russia even before the proxy war on Russia in Ukraine, and the economic warfare through the sanctions regime. What is your reading of the danger that this conflict could result in a nuclear exchange?
I'll say in one sentence that America has never been this close to nuclear war since we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which certainly elevated the risk of nuclear war, but I don't think that it came anywhere close to the risk that we're undertaking today. It's unfortunate that that leaders throughout the West have no experience with atomic war. I mean, now we're talking about hydrogen war. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were very small bombs compared to the nuclear warheads today. And one of our problems is that we have such a massive NATO alliance of nations, and some of them are outside of NATO, but friends of NATO, like Japan now, South Korea, and we do not have a central organizing intellect. If you look at Russia at war, while there's always the tug and pull of various interest groups and people who argue for this or that, ultimately, President Putin of Russia makes the final decisions, and he does it in a very rational format. We don't have that. We don't have a person who makes the decisions on war. We act to some degree in a type of consensus between the United States and Great Britain, but within a lot of very devious input from other sources, particularly the globalists what I call the boys from Davos and all of these other secret globalist organizations, where they have determined that we are going to have a war. It's going to be a world war. It's going to involve war against both Russia and China. And they're willing to throw the dice on it. And so we have this kind of shifting consensus where, for example, you had Biden make a fairly firm statement: we're not going to send tanks to Ukraine. And then the next thing, the global media puts out certain stories, and you have some more pressure for tanks, and the movement shifts, and all of a sudden you have tanks. So this is extraordinarily dangerous, because it used to be that, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had John Kennedy. For all of his flaws, he did control the decision on the employment of nuclear weapons, and so you had an individual, for all of his flaws, who made decisions. I'm not sure that you have an individual making decisions today. I'll give you a perfect example. Just this week, Representative Michael McCaul, the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, made a statement. He pulls up this memo. It was written by General Mike Minahan, who's the head of the mobility organization in the Air Force. He's one of the major combatant commanders. And Mike Minahan, General Minahan, had sent out a memo to all of his subordinates saying, "My gut tells me we will fight in," or let's say, he starts off, he says, he thought the U.S. would be at war with China in 2025, and then says, "My gut tells me we will fight in 2025. Now, it's quite extraordinary that a general would predict a war with a nuclear superpower on a date certain, almost a date certain, and a very near date also. 2025 is right around the corner. And then for the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee to wave that thing around and to comment on it, and then Representative McCaul says, "Well, I hope he's wrong, but I think he's right, unfortunately." These things don't just happen. These things are orchestrated. What are the odds that you have these two things happen simultaneously? I think they're rather small. So they're laying the groundwork. They're preparing the American public for a war with China. And we've been working on this. The deep state, the military-industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, they have been preparing the public for war with China for some years now. And they always start by demonizing the other side, accusing them of all kinds of things, most of which are untrue, and developing hatred. Americans are taught to hate Russians, to hate Chinese, to just hate people all over the globe: Venezuelans, Cubans, Syrians, Libyans. And they demonize these people, and that is the predicate then for some sort of typically a false flag that then triggers military force with all the hysteria that's whipped up surrounding it. So yes, we have a very elevated risk of nuclear war, far beyond anything that we have experienced since we actually dropped the bombs in World War II.
Well, you may have seen the RAND Corporation paper that was released this last weekend. It's titled "Avoiding a Long War: U.S. Policy and the Trajectory of the Russia-Ukraine Conflict," which argues, interestingly, that the quote, this is a quote, "costs and risks of a long war in Ukraine are significant and outweigh the possible benefits for the United States." So far, so good. But behind this sane statement is their fear that we won't be ready for the war with China. What they say is, quote, "The U.S. ability to focus on its other global priorities, particularly the competition with China, will remain constrained as long as the war is absorbing senior policymakers' time and the U.S. military resources." So what's your response to that?
Well, the RAND Corporation has typically been called upon to do studies and to do studies that tend to feed into a narrative of war. They would put it differently. This is simply my view of the way that it works. The RAND Corporation is very popular, particularly with Democratic presidents who, with the exception of George Bush, who was a very bloodthirsty president, the Democrats have typically been the initiators of war, starting with the First World War, Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War, and it didn't flip except with George Bush, and then it continued with the war on Libya, on the war on Syria, the war in Ukraine, and so RAND Corporation is very, very popular with them. I do agree. I think from a militarist standpoint, it is perhaps there are downsides to expending tremendous amount of wealth and energy in fighting a needless war with Russia if you were going to plan to attack China. Now, one of the bizarre things about the war in Ukraine is that the entire region that's being fought over is essentially Russian. Now, there is a political line drawn there, which says that, okay, these people are citizens of Ukraine. But the fact is that typically in these areas that are being fought over, from Kharkiv through the Donbass republics down to the southern part of Ukraine, these typically are 2/3 or 3/4 people who are Russians. They have Russian cultural background. They have Russian history. They worship in Russian Orthodox churches. They speak Russian as their first language, and many of them speak Russian as their only language. The thing that really blew up is that after the United States overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014, when it put the revolutionary junta in place, the junta promptly changed the Ukrainian constitution. The Ukrainian language is first, the Russian language is second. They stripped out the Russian language entirely, essentially making all Russian-speaking Ukrainians second-class citizens. And so you could not teach school. If you were a teacher who was 60 years old, spent your entire life teaching school, all of a sudden you couldn't teach school because you spoke Russian, you didn't speak Ukrainian. And it was really designed simply to be hurtful and hate-filled. And this was what characterized the regime in Ukraine. It is no wonder that the Donbass republics declared their independence. Imagine if during the American Revolution, instead of being told we've got a penny's tax on tea, we had been told starting tomorrow you're going to have to speak French, and people didn't speak French. And what would you can imagine the outrage in the colonies if that had happened. We would not have had anyone on the side of the British. There would have been no royalists in the colonies. So certainly the people who declared their independence in the Donbass republics had more than ample justification in doing so. But President Obama was already flooding weapons in to create a vast Ukrainian army with which to attack the Donbass and ultimately to make war on Russia itself.
So your service in the Marines and the Army was in the 1960s through the 1990s. And during the war in Vietnam and the Cold War, that was that era. How do you compare the thinking of the military leadership in that era compared to today? What do you say about Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin saying openly that, quote, one of the U.S.'s goals in Ukraine is to see a weakened Russia? The U.S. is ready to move heaven and earth to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. How can Russia not conclude that the U.S. is preparing for a direct war on Russia and therefore preparing itself to counter it?
You know, when the Soviet Union collapsed and dissolved in 1991, I was in the Pentagon, and one of my assignments was to conduct classes on the American military justice system, and I presented a class of study to quite a number of Russian generals and members of the Russian State Department. I have some very fine photos, official military photos that were taken of that, and I didn't initiate this, but the Pentagon initiated it, and the idea was that America was delighted with the fact that the Soviet Union was gone. The Wicked Witch was dead. Now we had a totally new environment, and we wanted to foster and encourage that. Now, I won't say that we did tremendous amount, but the United States, and including in the Pentagon, the generals in the Pentagon sincerely desired to have a good, peaceful relationship with Russia. I don't think they intended to initiate war against Russia at that point. These were responsible. We had some of the finest generals that we've ever had during the years that I was with the United States Army. And I do know that there was considerable dissatisfaction with the changeover, the new generals who were brought into prominence, like General Petraeus. General Petraeus was not well liked by the generals who had overseen the Cold War and who recognized the challenges. So there definitely is a great difference between the Army of today, the Army of yesterday. One of the things to remember is that there was a term under air-land battle doctrine, and it was called moral ascendancy. I don't know that it was ever precisely described, but it was widely understood that part of the reason, and this air-land battle doctrine, this precedes the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's in the years leading up to the collapse that this was instituted. And the idea is that we as Americans were morally ascendant. We were morally dominant over the enemy because we were better people. We had stronger moral values. Our children were raised in families. The Soviet Union tried to raise children in communes. We were a strongly moral Christian nation. The Soviet Union had a government whose official policy was atheism. So we felt that we were morally superior as a culture. We've lost that. If you look at things today, the Russian Constitution, and of course, Russia is nothing like the Soviet Union. It's totally a different form of government. But under the Russian Constitution, marriage is defined as the union of one man and one woman. God is mentioned in 3 places in their Constitution, unlike the U.S. Constitution, which does not mention God in any place. And they've instituted a whole series of laws to crack down on the type of grooming that goes on in the United States. You cannot promote homosexuality, not only in the schools, but among adults. Their rules on abortion are much stricter than those across the United States. And so, not to say that they are better in all respects, but you look at the decadence, the absolute moral decay in the United States, with President Obama projecting the rainbow colors on the White House. You see the transgender story hours where little children are being groomed to be more receptive to pedophiles and their sexual advances. We have same-sex marriage where now you have gay couples who can adopt little boys and do with them as they please. It really has become a very morally decadent culture. It's not that all of our people are that way, but our government has become a morally decadent government. And so we have lost our moral ascendancy, which I think is very important. And this is certainly a difference between the situation that we had when I was on active duty in the military and the situation that we confront today.
Recently, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS, published a public letter to President Biden on Thursday last week, with your name as one of the top signers on this document. It advises President Biden, as they did also to President Bush when he was preparing to go to war against Iraq back in 2003, based on fake intelligence regarding weapons of mass destruction, to change his intelligence staff, to, quote, replace your intelligence and military advisors with competent professionals. The sooner the better, end quote. So that advice obviously was not followed by Bush, and the disastrous wars in the Middle East followed. Will Biden follow the advice this time, or is it too late?
Well, I wish that the advice of VIPS, the Veterans for Sanity, would be persuasive. But the fact of the matter is that George Bush had the advisors that he wanted. He got the answers that he wanted, even though they were faked. They were deliberately distorted. He sent out General Colin Powell to stand in front of the United Nations, holding up a squirrely little test tube of green goopy stuff, waving it around, talking about sarin gas and how Iraq could destroy the world. And it was all a con. Colin Powell knew he was lying while he was talking to the United Nations. And the advisors that Bush and Cheney used were deliberately set up to bypass the traditional intelligence structure, which is fantastically massive in this country. But when they get ready to go to war, they choose the elements they want who will give them the answers they want. I think the same thing is happening with Biden today. I think that the intelligence he is receiving is the intelligence that he is intended to receive, and perhaps it's the intelligence that he personally wants to see. He has not proven himself to be a man of great tenderness towards anyone, or great sympathy towards people's suffering around the world. So I wish that we had other advisors, but I'm afraid that the people who plan the wars, the globalists, the members of the Senate and House Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committee, some of them, they're determined that we will have war, that we will have World War III, and they don't care what the facts on the ground are. They're just determined that they're going to roll the dice and attempt to conquer both Russia and China.
The British outlook, the so-called geopolitics that was first presented by Halford Mackinder in 1904, places the pivot of history in the so-called heartland of the Eurasian landmass. That includes basically Eastern Europe through part of Russia and northern China. And according to Mackinder, the control of this heartland would mean control of the world island, where the world island was basically the Eurasia continent together with Africa. That was called the world island. And if you control that, then you also control the world. The problem for the British was that the heartland was landlocked and was therefore not conquerable by sea. So the Britannia rules the waves didn't help. Their best bet was to get Germany and Russia to destroy each other and destroy much of Eastern Europe in the process. And voila, we had World War II. The Anglo-American view today is similar. Russia is no longer passively accepting any Anglo-American dictates. It's allied with China, cooperating with China on the Belt and Road. with almost the entirety of the rest of the world, the majority of nations in the world who are joined with Russia and China in the Belt and Road, rather than following the dictates of austerity and sanctions from the West. So the British have carefully nurtured their old Nazi networks in Ukraine and fostered a proxy war with Russia through Ukraine, leading possibly to full-scale war to conquer Russia, with China clearly in its sights, as you indicated. Is this going to work?
Well, this is a very interesting event in history. When Halford Mackinder presented his paper on the theory of the heartland in 1904, it created quite a shockwave, which is interesting. Halford Mackinder was a very patriotic Englishman, and he was concerned because Great Britain had created an enormous empire by what we would call rimland theory, which is that you control the world by controlling the seas, the ports, the areas adjacent to the ocean. It was very successful, and in fact, this is the same approach the United States has followed. Halford Mackinder, his approach was different. He said, look, we've got this vast land mass of Europe and Asia, which is all blended together. And he said the real determinant of who controls the world is who controls Eastern Europe. And he said, if you control Eastern Europe, you control the heartland. There are three great rivers that run through this heartland area. One of them being the Volga River through Europe, and then you have a great river that drains from Siberia into the Arctic Ocean. You have another one that drains from countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, drains into the Caspian Sea. This vast landmass, what's interesting is that transportation, heavy transportation, is done by river barges and so forth. And Mackinder was concerned that Britain perhaps was not sufficiently aware of the threat that in this heartland, this vast landlocked area, that countries could trade, they could move troops, they could conceal industrial production, they could do it without being vulnerable to sea power. There's a lot of validity to that. And not only are they not vulnerable to attack from the ocean, but they're not particularly vulnerable to air attack unless you get into nuclear weapons. Now, as Russia and China become closer, there is the ability for China to receive all of the natural resources it needs from Russia. Now, China's entire military policy has been based around avoiding what happened to Japan. Japan was reliant on oil. The United States was in a position to cut off its oil supply and cause its whole empire to wither. China wanted to be sure that they didn't fall prey to the same precise tactic by the United States. And so that's why they've begun to strengthen their navy and so forth in the South China Sea. Well, there is now this opportunity between Russia and China such that China can't necessarily be cut off from access to oil by the sea, because they can they can pipeline the oil, or they can truck the oil from Russia, and they can feed the country in this way. All of the natural resources that they import from abroad, they can simply move by land from Russia. So it creates a very interesting dynamic. You are correct that the traditional strategy by the United Kingdom has been to create wars between Germany and Russia, to foster them, to make sure that when Hitler's on his rise, he's got all the money he needs because it's coming out of the London banks and being channeled to him. And all of a sudden you have someone rather obscure who suddenly emerges as the force in Europe. You have American engineers who go to the Soviet Union, and they take a very primitive agrarian culture, and all of a sudden they build factories. We have the factories, the war factories that fed the Soviet Union during the Second World War were designed by American engineers. And this is laid out in the book Stalin's War, which is probably the most authoritative historical analysis ever, and it's a fairly recent publication. But there is geographical uncertainty. How important will the rimland theory be versus the heartland theory? There are reasons that people could argue one versus the other, and but they both are important.
Okay, so Helga Zepp-LaRouche recently issued something she calls the 10 Principles, promoting that this be a discussion topic amongst people, warning that people have lost a sense of principle in the way they think, that people tend to limit themselves to taking sides on issues that are really defined by the governments or by the media, usually with both sides being either irrelevant or negative. The 10 principles include, and I'll just do a quick sort of run through, a new international security and development architecture among perfectly sovereign nation states based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the UN Charter, to alleviate poverty, to build modern health systems in all countries, universal education for all, a new just international financial system to provide modern industry and agriculture for all nations, to end geopolitics and block thinking of us versus them, and to respect the security needs of all nations. A universal commitment and cooperation in the frontiers of science, such as in space exploration and fusion energy development. And most importantly, her 10th principle, a universal acknowledgement that the nature of man is fundamentally good, regardless of ethnicity, religious beliefs, or nationality. How can we intervene in the global dialogue to nurture this form of thinking?
Well, I think above all, we're going to somehow have to back away from war. You know, people don't really analyze these things, but the fact is that no nation has less need to go to war than the United States. No great nation, no great power. If you look at the United Kingdom, it's gone for many, many centuries without invasion because it's separated from the mainland of Europe by the English Channel, which is 21 miles long. People can actually swim the English Channel, particularly, I mean, not everybody, but very powerful swimmers can do it. If Great Britain can be prevented, can be safe from invasion for centuries and centuries by 21 miles of water, what about the United States, which is 5,000 or 6,000 miles of open sea from any potential adversary? So there is no genuine threat to the United States, and there never has been in any recent times. I think that realization would be good. I don't know that will ever permeate into the public consciousness, because with the power of the censored international media, they're able to convince Americans that we are physically threatened by a small country like Iraq on the other side of the planet. The notion is bizarre. It is ridiculous. It's absurd. But when you control the media, and the population doesn't know foreign policy, they don't know geography and so forth. And so you're able to simply tell them what you want them to believe, and they will believe it. But I think in terms of things to do, somehow we're going to have new national leadership. We're going to have a rebirth of Christian faith within our churches. I think there's tremendous decay that's taken place within Western religious circles. But we face an election in 2024. I wish we had presidential candidates who would go out and campaign and say, look, if you vote for me, I'm going to end these wars. I'm just going to stop them. Let people do what they want, but I'm going to preserve a strong nuclear deterrent. But we're going to stop fighting all over the globe, and we're going to downgrade the stature of NATO, which has become a very sinister force for aggressive war around the planet. But we will see whether we have leadership that's willing to buck the trend. If you look at what happened to Donald Trump, he was elected very solidly by the American people in 2016. And the reason that he was eventually overthrown is because he threatened the global one world order. He said he was going to downgrade NATO. He said he was going to pull back from our support of the terrorists in Syria. He was just going to not get involved in war, and he did as much as he possibly could to avoid war, and he even prepared us for a withdrawal from Afghanistan, which Biden later implemented. So Donald Trump was not ousted, and the election in 2020, which I firmly believe was transparently rigged, this didn't happen just because he sent out tweets that people found offensive or because he had a certain swagger and style. He was ousted because he was a threat to the global one world order. Now, ultimately, if we fall prey to this one world order, the global government, which is emerging across the globe, through this system of alliances and so forth. All freedom stems from sovereign nations. When your nation is no longer sovereign, when it is simply subservient to some greater alliance like the European Union is today, then you lose your voice. And eventually, if we have a global government that includes Russia, China, all of these other countries, then the people will have no voice. We will not be able to affect anything. There will be total censorship. The forces will control all of the currency, probably through a single digital currency, which they can turn on and turn off with the flick of a switch. So we're headed in a very difficult direction, and I think we just have to struggle on and do the best that we can to avoid falling into this pit, which will be so destructive.
Well, I certainly agree with you, and I commend you for working with us for these past years when we often, the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement, are practically the only voice expressing that kind of reality, that people have to turn their thinking away from war and us versus them. That's what the 10 principles were intended to evoke. So do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I continue to be fascinated by all of this, and we do a podcast which people can reach. It's if you do the @ symbol followed by Sen Richard Black, SEN Richard Black. You can pull us up on Twitter, and we have podcasts that are recorded there. We do that twice a week. So I invite people to join us in that. And meanwhile, we just keep fighting on and trying to achieve peace, trying to stop this endless slaughter of Ukrainian and Russian boys on the front. Thank you for what you're doing, Mike.
And thank you for your what you're doing and your participation in this, which I'm sure will have another impact. Maybe we can hit 1 million again.
We'll see.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.